with Stafford Smythe and Harold Ballard receiving jail time and criminal charges because of stealing from Maple Leaf Gardens. A lot of the Maple Leaf fans were saying, well, 73-74 has got to be better than 73 campaign, and it was. Toronto was so improved that year, there was a lot of people saying they were Stanley Cup contenders almost 3/4 away in the season. And eventually, they lost to the Stanley Cup Finals, the Boston Bruins, in the quarterfinals. And Toronto had a really good team that year. Now, Red Kelly did a great job. And, of course, Jim Gregory, as GM, made some key moves, including getting Inga Hammarström and Börje Salming from Team Sweden World Team and from the Elite League to play with Toronto. Now, this was the 57th season of the NHL franchise in Toronto and the 47th for the Maple Leafs. Again, the Leafs placed fourth to make the playoffs, but it was swept in the first round in a rough series against the Boston Bruins. Two of the games were basically one goal, and the last was a loss for Toronto in overtime. Now, the Maple Leafs made several signings that would improve their team before and during the campaign. At the entry draft, the Maple Leafs chose the great Lanny McDonald with the 4th overall draft pick. He had played nearly 7 seasons with the Leafs. Bernie Parent, who had left the team for the WHA in 72, made it known he wanted to return to the NHL. The Maple Leafs still had his NHL rights, and he traded Parent to the Flyers for Doug Favell, a very competent goalie, and a first-round draft pick, while the Leafs choose to choose two-way player Bob Neely. Neely would play 4 seasons for the Maple Leafs before being traded to the Colorado Rockies. Now, in the first for Toronto, the club signed players from Europe. Toronto took on Swedish defenseman Börje Salming and forward Inga Hammarström. Salming had made the All-Star team at the 73 Worlds. Now, Hammarström was one of the top scorers in Sweden. Both had played for Brynäs of the Swedish League, and the Leafs had to pay the Swedish Ice Hockey Federation for their release, similar to the Russians in the late 80s. Salming would play for the Leafs until 89 when he joined the Red Wings. Hammarström would play 5 rough seasons in Toronto, where the term chicken Swede was applied to him, even though that was unfair, and he moved on later to St. Louis. Now, Darryl Sittler led the team with 38 counters, while Normie Ullman, another great season with 47 assists. Sittler had 84 points total. Brian Glennie, that great fighter, led the Leafs in penalty minutes with 100. Dougie Favell had 14 victories and a 2.71 average. Now, it was very weird campaign, ladies and gentlemen. The lack of Ken Dryden in Montreal, I think, played a factor with Toronto winning the division, or what I call the East Division. And the Rangers had a strong team that year as well, and he took the Flyers pretty well, gave everything the Flyers he could deal with in the semifinals. Now, Toronto had a good record against most of the league. They were 2-4 against Boston, 3-2-1 against Buffalo, 2-2-1 against Detroit, 3-2 against the Habs, undefeated against the Young Islanders, 4-0-2, 2-1-2 against the Rangers, but lost every game to Vancouver except for one tie. So again, 16-5-7 in their own division. Now, Toronto also did well against the West. He went undefeated against Atlanta and California with 4-1 records. 1-3-1 against Chicago, 2-1-2 against LA Kings, 3-1-1 against Minnesota, 0-4-1 against the Flyers, 3-1-1 against Pittsburgh, and 2-2-1 against St. Louis, with a 19-12-9 record against the West. Now, Toronto was pretty consistent all season, although they were close to the 500 mark on Remembrance Day with a loss to Detroit. The rest of the season they were very, very consistent, and were beating. The big win, of course, of the season, everybody remembers, is the 9-2 shellacking on Boxing Day, which is considered one of the biggest victories for Toronto against the Habs ever in the regular season. We're also scoring a lot of goals that campaign, multiple 20-goal scores. We'll get that in a second. Now, the end of the campaign with a key victory against the Rangers in a back-to-back set. They tied the second game, then defeated Montreal and knocked off the Pro Sabres for their 35th win of the season. Now, again, Ullman had 22 counters. Paul Henderson, another consistent year. 24 goals, 31 assists for 55 points. Davey Keon, 25 counters, 53 points. Ron Ellis hit 20 goals again with 23. Inga Hammarström hit 20 goals. Jim McKinney, Boris Salming, Ian Turnbull, and Mike Pellick led the defenders. 14, 5, 8, and 12 goals. with 42, 39, 35, and 31 points. Rick Kehoe, and a kind of a, let's say, an underrated season, but 18 goals didn't tell the whole story, 40 points. Lanny McDonald had 30 points in his rookie campaign. The reliable Gary Monahan at 25 points, including 9 counters. Timmy Ecclestone in limited action at 9 counters and 23 points. Glennie had 22 points in 65 games. Eddie Shack returned to Toronto with 15 big points in 59 contests. Errol Thompson, again, limited play, 15 points as well. Bob Neely, who also played defense, was on left wing. And young George Ferguson had 4 assists in 16 contests. Now, the goaltending was shared by Dougie Favell. Of all people, Eddie Johnston, who came over from Boston with a 12-94 record, and Dunk Wilson, the former Vancouver, what do you call, not say backup, but Gary Smith's good friend between the pipes, with a 9-11-3 record. Now, transactions, of course, the big situation here, picking up Eddie Johnston and Dunk Wilson in the third week of May to secure their fall. Tim Ecclestone came over in November, which was a good addition for sure. Now, the draft with McDonald, Neely, and Turnbull. Turnbull was a steal. At 15 overall, he played with the Ottawa 67s at the time. That's probably the best top 3 they've had in quite some time. They had 3 picks in the top 15, you can imagine this. And other than that, it was just filler. Now, as for the playoffs against Boston, it was a weird series because nobody expect Boston to have a hard time with Toronto. It was going to be similar to 72, but the first contest in the Boston Garden was hard fought from the start. Only Greg Shepard's goal at 4:22 of the second period gave Boston enough of the 1-0 victory. Now, Game 2 was all Boston on the score sheet, even though Davey Keon tied it up at 2 at the end of the first after counters by Ken Hodge and Bobby Schmaltz. Ellis had scored previously in the period. Now, in the third, Busick and Cashman scored with Sittler replying, but in the third period, the second period, Busick and Cashman, third, Esposito and Shepard on a shorthand summed it up, and Gilles Gilbert had another great game as he got the blank also in Game 1. Now in Toronto, Bob Neely staked Toronto with an early 1-0 lead, but Andre Savard and Shepard back-to-back, following by Johnny Busick, made it 4-1, with Sittler scoring his second of the series in 1930 to make it 4-2. Now, Wayne Cashman made it 5-2. Eddie Shack scored his first at 2:20, but Bobby Schmaltz wrapped it up for the 6-3 victory. But Game 4, it was a hard fought from the start. Terry O'Reilly gave Boston an early lead at 8:53 to first, with Ellis tying it up in 14:56. Now, in the second, Hodge put Boston ahead, but Normie Ullman scored at 8:58 to make it to 2-2. But in the third, they thought that Bobby Orr's power play goal at 17:34 was going to sink the Leafs, but Inge Hammerstrom replied at 18:43 and one of the biggest goals of his career. But then Ken Hodge early at 87 seconds of the extra time won it for Boston and advanced them again to the semifinals. Gilles Gilbert played all 4 games for Toronto, which Favell and Eddie Johnson shared. Now, not to sound completely bizarre here, ladies and gentlemen, but Toronto would have bet Boston, they probably would have given Chicago a hard shake because they were close in points. Toronto that was a Stanley Cup contender, like Red Kelly's coaching. They had scored more goals and gave up less. I think the plus-minus went from minus 37 to plus 47 or something like that, which is a big deal, especially in the tough East Division. So the 73-74 Toronto Maple Leafs, to say they were Stanley Cup contenders, they were. If you had maybe 5 or 10 goals here or there in the regular season to give them a better position in the playoffs, I don't think anybody could have won on the road against Boston in that the early series. Only the Flyers could do that. So, but Toronto was, it not say saved the franchise, but it basically brought a lot of fans back. It was a rebirth year for the Toronto Maple Leafs, and a lot of new fans of the Leafs in the 70s became Leafs fans when Hammerstrom and Salming. It was called, in a lot of ways, the modern NHL, the European influence we see now. The seeds of success were dealt with Hammerstrom and Salming, and of course, we're still paying dividends for sure. And later, of course, Matt Sundin coming in kept that legacy of Boria and Inga going. And Boria, we do miss him. A tragic end to his life, but he's still a hero to many Maple Leaf faithful. So, ladies and gentlemen, that's the story of the 73-74 Toronto Maple Leafs. If you like what they're doing here with our podcast on the Buds, let us know when to like, comment, subscribe, and share. And don't forget, requests in any category, movies, TV, entertainment, sports, politics, are highly encouraged and highly considered. Have a good one. Bye.
Introducing the all-new